do this one online. So that's the reason why we are doing it. It's the third one in the current run of the series. We started them over 2 years ago, and we obviously had a break during COVID. But this is the third one we've done since restarting them a couple of months ago. The first one we held was looking at transport and the return to the office and new working patterns. The second one last month, we looked at the budget and spending review. Feels like an awful long time ago now, and the impact on things around levelling up and things like that, which was obviously very important, even though of course the levelling up white paper has been delayed yet again to the early part of the new year. So the event tonight is a real hot topic and one that's actually gathering momentum all the time when we look at the plans around the clean air zone and ask the question, is it helping the city to breathe? As ever, we've got a panel of expert speakers on this. First up, we'll hear from Megan Black, who's the Head of Logistics and Environment at Transport for Greater Manchester. Then we'll listen to Mark Curry to give us the business view on issues around the clean air zone. Mark is the Chief Executive of Mantra Learning, that specialises in logistics, and he's also the Chair of the Greater Manchester Learning Provider Network. And then to finish off, we'll hear from Christian Spence, the Head of Economic Data and Analytics Future Economies at MMU. And then after that, we will throw it open for questions from anyone on there about anything you may have heard tonight at the event. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to share screen and see if I can get Megan's presentation up. If you just bear with me 1 minute. Just waiting a bit to load. Hopefully that should be on screen now. Yeah, everything okay? Yeah. Excellent. Megan, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So I just thought I'd start off by giving people an update as to where things are with the development of Greater Manchester's Clean Air Plan. So if you could move to the next slide. Thanks. What is the Clean Air Plan, and I suppose a question of why is it being developed? So the journey that Greater Manchester's been on around developing its Clean Air Plan has been going on since since 2018, when the Greater Manchester local authorities, or many of them, were directed to act to deal with high exceedances of nitrogen dioxide on the local road network. So Greater Manchester authorities came together to develop a clean air plan, and this has now been agreed. And obviously the reason that they're doing that is the fact that air pollution is linked to a range of very serious health conditions, contributes to early deaths, and in Greater Manchester, public health colleagues suggested it's linked to the deaths of about 1,200 people each year in Greater Manchester. So as we have been working on the development of this plan, we have been following the government guidelines that set out how you develop a clean air zone. Their framework is very clear on the principles of how you would operate one. And we have, using those framework and guidelines set out, and they have now directed us to introduce a Category C charging clean air zone across the whole of Greater Manchester. So in terms of that, it means that we are going to, excuse me, just lost my train of thought. We are going to secure compliance with nitrogen dioxide legal limits on local roads in the shortest possible time, and by 2024 at the latest. And the Clean Air Plan is not just about introduction of the zone, but it's also about the fact that there is funding support available to help people upgrade to cleaner vehicles, which is basically what the zone is doing. It's trying to encourage people to move to cleaner vehicles to enable us to meet the legal limits around nitrogen dioxide. So if you could move to the next slide, Chris, please. The clean air zone that is being implemented will operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. And it's going to cover all the Greater Manchester local authorities, and it will include all roads within Greater Manchester, apart from those roads that are managed by National Highways. So those are the motorway and trunk roads. The zone is going to be introduced in 2 phases. So from the 30th of May next year, it's going to be introduced for HGVs, buses, hackney carriages and private hire vehicles. So it's for those vehicles that don't meet the emission standards of the zone and are not considered compliant. And then from Thursday, the 1st of June, it's going to be introduced for LGVs, or light goods vehicles or vans, minibuses, coaches. Coaches need to get themselves an exemption to get to that date, and those will be the exemption applications open at the end of January. And it will also apply to Greater Manchester licensed hackney carriages and private hire vehicles at that time too. So as I say, it's about vehicles that don't meet the emission standards, and those vehicles will need to pay a daily charge to travel in the zone. I just want to make it really clear that this doesn't apply to private cars, motorbikes or mopeds. They're not part of the Greater Manchester scheme. And the whole point of the zone, as I mentioned, is about improving air quality by encouraging the upgrade to cleaner vehicles. It isn't the same as a congestion charge zone where all or most vehicles are charged to drive in. This is about cleaning up the fleet that is driving on the roads in Greater Manchester. So if we move to the next slide, Chris, I've just set out the fact that in terms of the funding that's available to help people upgrade their vehicles, the funding is set out there on the table. I hope everybody can see that table because on my screen it's slightly cut off at the edges, but it sets out by vehicle type the amount of money that's available in terms of money for replacement or financial support that's available to help people retrofit their vehicle to meet the standards of the zone. So the funding will be available for people who meet the eligibility criteria. So one of the things that the Greater Manchester authorities did when they agreed the final clean air plan was agree the policy around the funding. And the first phase of that funding opened at the end of November to eligible HGV owners. And then the second phase of funding is opening at the end of January, and that will open for all other vehicle types. So one of the things I would encourage people to do, if they haven't done so already, is to sign up for our newsletters, because that will allow people to find out all about the various milestones of the Clean Air Plan. And if people feel that they might be impacted through the vehicle that they own, that there is an online checker available on cleanairgm.com to enable people to find out exactly whether their vehicle is impacted by the zone and whether they are eligible for financial support. So just a final slide from me, Chris, just to say that there's an awful lot of activity going on at the moment to drive engagement and action around helping people to prepare for the clean air zone. You'll see there the fact that we've done media briefings and press releases. We've got adverts that are out and about in Greater Manchester, and we've also got some on social media, some targeted advertisements as well. The other things that we've been doing is we have used the DVLA data for the HGVs to send a letter to all non-compliant registered keepers of vehicle in Greater Manchester to let them know that the zone is coming and that their vehicle, according to DVLA records, would be impacted. And we plan to do that when the next round of funding goes live in January as well. But the other thing that people may start or may have started seeing already are the fact that the signs for the clean air zone are starting to be put up, and also the cameras that will enforce the zone are also starting to become visible as well, which is obviously driving people's awareness of the zone that's coming. So I hope you found that a useful update, and clearly I'd be happy to take any questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, thanks very much, Megan. And just to clarify, with the charges, there will be for non-compliant HGVs, that'll be £60 a day.
Yeah.
I think for light goods vehicles, it's £10 a day. For taxis, it's £7.50 a day.
That is correct.
On that as well. So it's a good test of my knowledge there. So I've been listening to some of those briefing sessions, but I think that just sets it in context really about what the key things are. And also, from a chamber perspective, we've also been getting that message out to as many businesses as we possibly can do as well, because it is important that they know about this and can do something about it. Just speaking of businesses, what I'd like to do now, and like I said, we may have questions for Megan in due course. What I'd like to do now is ask Mark Curry to join us. He's the Chief Executive of Mantra Learning and also the Chair of the Greater Manchester Learning Provider Network. And Mark, the whole logistics industry is something that you've been very heavily involved with over a number of years now, and I'd just like to hear from you the sort of business angle on the clean air zone and any thoughts you may have on this.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, and thanks, Megan, first of all, and for the very smart presentation. And I'm afraid to say, Chris, I haven't got one to follow that, so you'll just have to put up with me rattling on, I'm afraid. But I think, first of all, it's important just to say that as an individual, as a citizen of Greater Manchester, I'm hugely behind cleaning up the city in any which way and shape and form we can to make it a better place to live and work, and as our mayor says, to die in as well. So I just think it's important to get that on record, Chris, that I am a supporter of that. However, I think there's this process, I guess, began in 2018. We hadn't planned the pandemic at that point in time, and we should be considering some of the impacts of the pandemic on where we are today. And just think it's worth highlighting some of the implications on businesses being enabled to clean up the vehicle fleet, not least of which there's currently a 58% rise in modern second-hand vehicles, i.e. Euro 6 vehicles. 58% is absolute. Normally we have a decreasing rate for second-hand vehicles, but there's a rise of 58% at the moment, if you can get them. The second piece is that driver wages have increased by 35% over the last 18 months. And finally, fuel's increased by 15% in the last 4 months. So if you add that cocktail together of your three main component variable costs and fixed costs of operating vehicles, you've got a real cocktail of increased cost in a sector that accounts for around about 10% of GDP. So that will have an impact on inflation before we talk about the £15,600 a year increase in tax that you've got on vehicles that aren't able to be compliant. I think that the further piece to this is I recognise, and I think I'm right in saying that if you've ordered a vehicle, you get or you ordered a conversion kit, you do get a dispensation for an amount of time, somewhere between 6 months and a year, to enable you to purchase that equipment. So that's okay if we then can get the equipment. At the moment, I think a brand new truck, there's a waiting list of around about 6 to 12 months for a new truck. If you can get one, and indeed the manufacturers are really hampered by component parts, particularly semiconductors, and this is apparent across the piece. So the recognition of when you're investing in a new truck, and we're talking about £100,000 of equipment, that's okay in theory if you can get them, which is in doubt at the moment. But there's also the uncertainty across the cities on what the different rules are going to be in different clean air zones. So many hauliers are running vehicles across the country. It's not just Manchester Leeds, it's not just Manchester Birmingham, it's across the country. And it would be really helpful if we had some commonality of conditions that hauliers have got to meet across the different clean air zones, both now and over the next 10 years, which is what you'd expect the life of a truck to be. And it wouldn't be a great thing from an environmental perspective if the life of that truck was any less than 10 years. I'm not going to go into the green implications of curtailing the life of an existing vehicle. We are able to get a conversion kit for older vehicles, but it's not inexpensive. I believe it's around about the actual equipment itself is somewhere between 12 and 14,000, plus the cost of fitting. So if you're one of the small number of organisations who's able to get support for that conversion kit, and my understanding at the moment is only micro businesses that are able to get that support at £16,000. That offsets it depending on the actual cost of the conversion itself, and as well as the equipment. But there's only a limited number of hauliers that are going to be able to get this support. So I asked the question, how are those other hauliers going to manage with the increasing costs I've already talked about in terms of diesel, in terms of labour costs? And that may cause a number of them to go out of business, and that may or may not impact on other businesses in the Greater Manchester community to shift their freight, to export what they need to do, and to move their product around the country. So a final point I've got, Chris, is will businesses be tempted to site their distribution centres in Warrington as opposed to Logistics North, Trafford Park, Stakehill Industrial Estate, and try and avoid Greater Manchester? And then we have the issue, well, what's happened? How will those organisations in Warrington be able to get the people to deliver and to work in those warehouses? They're probably going to travel from Greater Manchester. So then we've got the increase in CO2 from the labour that will inevitably be sourced in the likes of Oldham, Rochdale and Bolton, will then have to travel over to Warrington. So it isn't a completely straightforward picture of just eliminating the particularly pollutant vehicles from Greater Manchester. They may be pushed elsewhere, and we may then increase our carbon count by moving to those areas. So hopefully that adds a bit of flavour, Chris, to some of the unintended consequences of what we've got that was set up in 2018, and we're now having to deal with and implement in a pandemic world.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and some really interesting points there. Mark, just while we've had a question in the chat box, and this is an interesting one actually. Might get very technical all of a sudden. A question from something called DD3 on the call. Where a conversion is possible for an existing vehicle, what is actually converted? We may have to Google that one and come back to come back on that one. Megan, do you know what is actually converted?
I would call it a retrofit, and I think it depends on the type of vehicle that you've got, whether it's something that's done to the exhaust system or it's something that is done further up in the engine. But in terms of clean air zones and the money that comes from government to help fund people to do the upgrades or the retrofits, it has to be accredited by a scheme that the Energy Saving Trust run to ensure that that retrofit solution does actually then make it meet the standards of a clean air zone, and it then allows the DVLA record to be updated to show that that is the case. Okay, thank you. So it's something to do either in the engine or the exhaust, really. But we'll no doubt probably all become experts on this over the next few months as we get nearer to the start of the scheme. Mark, there's a few points there, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But finally, to wrap up the sort of panel bit of this, I'd like to ask Christian to say a few words and give his thoughts and observations on this. Christian.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. Pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for coming and joining. I'm also going presentationless for change because I think that's often a nice thing to do. And I kind of want to draw on three things around. It's going to draw on the kind of the economics and the policy of the wider thing, because I think that's where we can perhaps try to tease out. I think as well as kind of some of the frustrations from business as well, which I think some of which I think are valid. But let's go through these. So I think number one, kind of from an economic point of view, something like this kind of fits within a branch of economics we call welfare economics, and it's kind of relatively straightforward. The theory is pretty straightforward, in that for anything like this, pollution, anything where there's externalities involved, something you do affect someone else. The broad principle is polluter pays, to put it simply. The costs that you pass on to some other person through the externality itself, be that pollution or noise or anything that might be. Generally, the cost of that should be paid by the person who's doing that. So in kind of raw economic terms, things like this, in the same way you could say congestion charges, in the same way you can say, you know, existing rural fuel duties and road fund duties and road fund licenses all sort of fit within that thing. So from a kind of a tool within, you know, a policymaker's armory to try and achieve a specific policy objective, it kind of ticks the boxes, and you know, there's nothing actually terribly surprising, at least at the high level within all of this. I think the second one, and I think Mark makes some really interesting points, actually, is one of the great challenges in policy making is, you know, when, you know, I don't think everything that's happening this evening, probably, I don't know if Boris is still talking, is events have a habit of taking over and causing some challenges. So I think obviously this is all, you know, the challenges of air pollution in British cities generally, never mind in Greater Manchester, has been running for a very long time. The British government has been sued and fined a number of times by the European Commission for breaching safe air quality limits, and that's essentially where the core legislation for this comes from. And of course, no one expected that you'd be trying to do all of this in a pandemic. And I think that is a challenge. But I think from the policymaker's point of view, the policymaker always has to try and have their eye on the longer game rather than the short transitory stuff. And so somehow we need to find a way of separating the core issue, which is essentially air quality. Let's be really blunt. Air quality in Greater Manchester is killing people. That's the policy problem. The only real way to deal with that is you need to improve the air quality. And this is the first kind of bit of legislation that's come through to really try and force places to move quickly. And government has provided some funding. So I think the challenge of the pandemic does leave you in this difficulty of how do you manage this trade-off. But I think we need to understand that this trade-off is a short-term and temporary one, and that the objective of clean air and not killing people sort of remains in scope. So this is the moment really when, you know, governments for me would be moving in with additional measures to support. So, you know, additional financial control. I know from Greater Manchester's point of view, they have very little control over the budget they've got to deploy to support businesses through this. This should be, you know, a natural move for central government to deal with those challenges. Particularly, I know Mark, you mentioned about things like the second-hand market at the moment, and that is moving to new vehicles is incredibly difficult for that. And then, so that's kind of my second point really, is to separate the core issue from temporary, you know, the core long-term problem and its solution from temporary policy challenges. And then thirdly is kind of the wider policy context. So, you know, a couple of both Megan and Mark have said, you know, this isn't a congestion charge. You know, so this doesn't work in the same way that the congestion charge in London does. A congestion charge is there to target, essentially the clues in the name, to target congestion. This is about air quality. But I think there's an interesting bit about thinking about how those two things and other things sit side by side. So we know we have a very clear political commitment from Mayor Andy Burnham of GM that there will be no congestion charge implemented in Manchester during his time as mayor, or at least certainly during this second term. Lots of our political leaders have been bit hard by that since the last referendum. However long ago that was now, just over 10 years ago. But I think these things do sort of interact. You know, the planning map, which shows where GM is in breach of its nitrous oxide limits, which is essentially what the Clean Air Plan is there to solve. It kind of focuses on the very, very heavily congested travel corridors. So clearly there is a relationship between the nitrous oxide stuff and congestion generally. And so I would suggest that there's, in a wider, longer-term policy objective, clearly removing congestion and improving air quality and improving public transport and mobility for people all come together, but at some point you have to decide what it is you're going to tackle first. And I guess the aside on this is the Clean Air Plan is absolutely designed to do one very specific thing. It's to get nitrous oxide pollution limits into their safe legal zone, essentially. It's not looking at anything else. But I'm sort of intrigued as to see how the longer term of this sort of starts to play together, the balance between the air quality issue and the congestion issue and the wider mobility. Obviously, TfGM, of course, has its long-term freight strategy as well, and one part of that is about trying to deal with, multiple deliveries of freights into urban centres and things like that. So there's a lot of things clashing together there, and it'd be nice to sort of spend some of the Q&A sort of trying to unpack some of those for me. So those are my 3 points, Chris. Kind of from a welfare, the economics of this is polluter pays, and that makes perfect sense in many ways. Secondly, we've got some temporal challenges against the deadline that we need to save people's lives. And actually, the mode for remedying that really should be coming from central government, who's best placed to bear that risk. Additional funding to help those businesses through. And thirdly, let's not take our eye off the wider policy context. Air quality is important, but there's other things going on here about congestion, mobility, and healthy lives.
Thanks very much, Christian. And just picking up on that last point there, and I think people are getting a little bit confused with some of this stuff as well, because, and maybe Megan, you want to comment on this, but it's very easy, isn't it, to sort of conflate the air quality bit with net zero. Because what a lot of people are thinking about is, oh, well, what I'll do is I'll go out and buy an electric vehicle, then I won't pay a charge. Now, that's more driven by net zero rather than air quality. This is as Christian said, purely about air quality. Is there a danger that we begin to blur the edges a little bit here, or does that really matter in the long run? Because we're going to have to do something about net zero as well. Is this a way of tackling both at the same time?
Is that all for me? Or
Megan?
Yeah, I was going to say, Christian's exactly right in what he says. This is designed to tackle nitrogen dioxide, the exceedances. It's very much a focus that has come, it is a direction that has come from government to the local authorities to do it. If you look as to why the local authorities have been directed to do it, it's because the government has lost successive challenges that have been raised to it by Client Earth. Greater Manchester is not the only authority or set of authorities that are having to deal with the introduction of a clean air zone, although it is one of the largest ones, because it is an urban conurbation. And as you say, if you look at the map where we declared an air quality management area back in 2016, the exceedances that we're seeing for the clean air plan, sort of match that because of the traffic movements that we've got. And I think in terms of net zero, yes, it is a kind of a different conversation in some respects, but they are interlinked in the fact that if people are moving to compliant vehicles, there will be a benefit in terms of carbon, but not necessarily as big a benefit as you would get of people going to electric vehicles. Although saying that, if you look at the funding that we've got available for people to help them upgrade, particularly when you look at the taxi trade, then there is there are different amounts that people can be supported with through those financial schemes. And there is more money on offer for those people that do want to move to a zero emission capable vehicle. And that is in recognition of the fact of, that in the long run, there will be a benefit of them running round, for want of a better expression, the urban centres where they tend to dwell.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Again, it's important. I've been on other calls where people have said, hang on, just let's get this clear. This isn't being driven by net zero, but obviously there's a benefit, if you want to use that phrase, to some of that larger stuff in there. Mark, I just want to come back to you and pick up on something that is niggling me about some of this as well. You mentioned that they're about the sort of confusing array of different charges. There's Greater Manchester will be a category C. That's the one that excludes private vehicles. There's obviously a category A, B, and D as well. Do you think this is just going to create even more confusion? Because it's not just different categories. There's different charges as well, isn't there? In some you could be paying £50, others in 100. In Greater Manchester, it's £60 for an HGV. What's the view from the industry about that? I mean, that's just going to create even more problems. And if I can do, and you may not be able to answer this, what happened when they started the zone in London, and obviously the ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone in London? What impact has that had on business, and is it going to be worse this time around with the clean air zones than it was with that? Quite a few questions there, but I'd be interested in your view coming from the industry.
Yeah, I'm not close enough, Chris, to the London economy, to the London logistics economy, to understand what's going on. What I can say is most of London big logistics is outside London.
Yeah.
It's outside the clean air zone. It's outside the ULEZ zone. Whereas actually we've got a lot of our big logistics facilities actually inside the clean air zone. And actually, unless I'm incorrect, Christian, I think some of the hotspots on where we've got the most pollution in GM is actually on the M60 west of the city, where we cut the 62 and we cut the 56 and we cut the 66. That corridor is a transit corridor from other cities to other cities, creating pollution that actually won't get charged at all with non-compliant vehicles, because they'll just be going through the city, and it's on a major road, on a major trunking route, or on a motorway, so there won't be any charge for it. So actually, in terms of improving this being a deterrent to vehicles coming through the city with that are not clean, won't make a blind bit of difference.
Okay, Matt, the point about the different categories and charges and one thing or another, that's just going to be a logistical nightmare, I guess, for businesses when they start getting bills and things landing on the doormat for paying charges.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult enough already trying to organise. I mean, in fact, it'll all be deducted at source, because and you'll end up with it going straight to the traffic commissioner when you don't pay your bill, so you'll lose your operator's license, and there won't be a problem anymore. But there will be a problem, because there won't be the hauliers to shift the freight we need shifting, and I think that's a key point that we shouldn't underestimate. The freight prices are already going absolutely through the roof. I mean, the rates that you're able to command today as a haulier, and bear in mind, I have a haulage company as well as a training company, so I'm quite close to it. But the rate's fantastic. So somewhere along the track, someone's going to have to pay for this increase in cost. And particularly if you're operating specialist vehicles, which tend to be older, where there's a lot of I mean, this can be £250,000 for cranes and various other particularly technical pieces of kit, which they've got a 20-year life on these vehicles as opposed to a 10-year life perhaps. They'll just put the charge, they'll put the increased rate onto the consumer. So careful what you ask for. But I mean, it's not just hauliers that have got older vehicles. Every day I go past white vans that are 20 years old, Euro 3 engines in them, belching smoke out. It's revolting, and I'm seeing that coming in late. And if you actually look, I don't know the stats, Christian, but I'd love to know what the relative number of vehicles were in that category in the city versus the number of HGVs.
Good question. I'm not sure whether Megan would have that or whatever it is, but you make an interesting point there in that around the motorways. And Megan, I'll come back to you on this, because motorways are not part of this because they're owned by Highways England, and they're not covered by the same legal requirements under local authorities or one thing or another. And obviously, as Mark said, parts of the M60 at times a little better than a car park, really. But if you don't come off that motorway, you will not be charged. And that, is there a way we can close that loop, or is there something needs to be done at a government level to tackle that? Because that doesn't seem fair in one respect, to be quite honest. And of course, pollution moves around, doesn't it? So is there anything that can be done with that, or are we just sort of victims of the system?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Pollution does move around, which is one of the reasons why the 10 Greater Manchester authorities, came together to develop a single clean air plan. In terms of the strategic road network, yes, absolutely, it's managed by the National Highways now, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they have been directed by government in a different way, and that's something that the Greater Manchester authorities have always sort of highlighted back to government when our politicians have talked to ministers, in the fact that doesn't seem the right thing, particularly given the M60 that runs through Manchester. But it's almost, sort of, we are where we are. Tameside as a council have highlighted a particular route, the A57, the A628 that runs through Mottram and Hollingworth. And there's been some work done on that. And I don't know whether people have picked up that in the sort of final plan, ministers had confirmed that they were willing to look at introducing charging on that stretch of road. And so there's a piece of work that's going on at the moment looking at that. But again, that's a decision for the ministers to take as ultimately they're their roads.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Megan. Like I said, it is a cause of something that just again illustrates this bit. And again, it's going back to the different categories, different charges, whereby this thing has been sort of imposed and implemented, and there's different bits of it scattered all over the country. And the biggest thing, the motorway network is kept completely apart. So it's a real mishmash of things. Craig, you've got your hand up. Hopefully you got a question for the panel.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, apologies. I mean, apologies for my ignorance of this policy area, but I really enjoyed the discussion. It's really informative. Just thinking about something Christian said actually about obviously the point of this being to save lives, which obviously shouldn't be forgotten, but it makes me wonder about how this is playing out sort of in fiscal terms. If we are reducing the cost of healthcare, I don't know what the estimations are of that. As I say, I don't know much about the policy area. The cost of healthcare as a result of this over the long term, you're potentially making the economy more productive if there are less unhealthy people resident in Greater Manchester. And then so what are the what's the bureaucracy and the politics of that sort of economic value being captured for the local area in order to perhaps help the businesses that are worried about the short-term costs of this. If this is it's going to have an economic benefit and fiscal benefit to the city region, then perhaps by implementing it we should get the rewards of that too. And I genuinely don't know how that's sort of being integrated into the policy process at present. I'd be interested to know more.
Interesting question, Christian. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. Or...
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, CBI did a quite a chunky report into the clean air zones when they're coming through. They think potentially 28 million a year net direct benefit to Greater Manchester as a whole, mostly through when you I think one of the chief challenges in welfare economics is once you start to do the numbers, you end up bumping very quickly against the very hard facts that you're dealing with, which is basically we end up with people who can therefore be healthier and therefore work more against sort of costs of death and all the rest of it. So it quickly becomes quite a bit of a gruesome area to work in doing the numbers. But they think a core net benefit of about 28 million a year out of cleaning the air up, because essentially fewer people are off with asthma, with health-related conditions currently caused by the air. So you sort of can boil it down into all of that.
Okay, cool. Megan, have you got anything else to add to that one? Because obviously, it's a big thing, isn't it? Again, if you reduce that cost down in the healthcare bit, it's able to reinvest it elsewhere. Obviously, I presume that's been worked through as part of the plan, I guess, when it was in its forming stage.
The plan follows the government guidelines, and the government guidelines is the primary focus is reduction of nitrogen dioxide to its legal limits. That is our number one primary objective. So
that's the driving force behind it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else being that sort of additional bit
is a secondary consideration.
Yeah. Okay, that's quite clear. And again, this is interesting stuff because it's there's a lot of things that are coming out of this that you can say, oh, well, it's being done for this reason, but actually there's some very clear sort of black and white messages that's sitting around this. Christian, I want to come back to you. One of the last points you made there around looking at the sort of wider context of this around transport and congestion and one thing and another. Where do you see this sort of fitting? You see this as the start of a much longer process to enable some of those new networks and travelling improvements and things to take place, or would it be dangerous to view it in that way? And as we've just heard from Megan, there's a definite reason why this is being done. Or should we be actually using this as a bit more of an opportunity?
I think there's optimism to be taken from that. And when I tend to sort of describe policy challenges like this, where you've got actually a lot of tension, essentially you're choosing via a legislative agenda to directly increase the costs of some part of the business or consumer world operating. That's at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. That's what any kind of environmental taxation is about ultimately. I always find it helpful to kind of describe it and to ask for teaching this to students to kind of see this in a much longer time period. It's like, so if we think about the existing national and international government commitments to climate change, to clean air, to decarbonisation of the economy, if we think about national and local politicians' decisions for net zero, for reduction of congestion, for active lives, for active travel, for reducing reliance on cars for small journeys, I think if you want to put all that together and then look at that over horizon to 2040, what you can say is ultimately, look, the goal is by 2040, 2050, there's no petrol and no diesel being burned. And a third to half of all journeys within Greater Manchester are by walking or cycling. And so that actually over the 20-year horizon, all of this is kind of irrelevant in the bigger picture. If we are net zero by 2035, I think the 2038 Greater Manchester's commitment, then a lot of the kind of the little stuff we're currently arguing about does this phase over 1 year or 2 years, and is it going to be 120 or 160 pounds, is kind of broadly irrelevant over the 10-year, 20-year program here. And so that way then I think is you should approach these kind of policy problems with that in mind. And I think this is actually where central government can be much more helpful in terms of smoothing these, because all you're doing is smoothing. What we're essentially, we know that no politician will ever be elected if they, sorry, I'm rushing ahead of myself. So I mean, one of the things that's sort of interesting is, every time you survey the British public, the big polling houses survey the British public about their views on net zero, and do you think we should, do you agree with the premise that we should all be net zero and carbon neutral and, not driving by 2030, 2040, they're all overwhelmingly in favour. And they're mostly in favour because no politician has actually levelled with them and told them what the changes to their lives that are going to be involved to do that. And so, where a national government and international government could be helpful here is in smoothing these curves. I guess to summarise everything I've just waffled about, we're going to be at a zero emissions, active travel situation by default because of kind of international commitments, never mind national or local, over the next 15 years or so. The question is, how on earth do we get there, and how do we help to bring as much of the economy along with us and maintain their viability as we do that? And I think if we look at it from that context, rather than how do we deal with charges for nitrogen pollution over the next 18 months, which is over the longer period broadly irrelevant because it'll be wiped out by other things, we see that this is just a short-term problem that needs smoothing, and government is really good at smoothing through economic cycles or through policy cycles, and it should be doing more to help that.
Accidentally put myself on mute there, which is a new one. Some people may think that might be a good thing. I'm not too sure. Anyway, Mark, just another one for you. I mean, one of the you mentioned it there around where these major distribution centres are, and one thing and another. And obviously, there's a lot of investment gone into those. And again, obviously, let's bear in mind it's just the non-compliant vehicles that are going to be paying the charge. It's not straight across the HGV bit. But can you see somewhere along the line with this, and it's picking up a little bit on what Christian's just been outlining there, that somebody in the sector, somebody in the industry will come up with a bright idea to say, actually, we should be doing it this way. Now, that might be smaller distribution centres. I don't know what that quite looks like. But could you see that happening within the sector eventually? Because it's Greater Manchester today, but it's Bradford as well, it's Leeds, it's Liverpool, it's all over the place. Do you think this will spark some form of innovation in the logistics sector? Quite simply just to make things easier and obviously make sure people aren't paying any more than they need to.
Yeah, I think you've already got significant innovation in logistics that's happened over many, many years. And to an extent, these large distribution centres we're talking about are part of that innovation. And the decision-making time on those centres is 25 to 50 years. So a shed may have a 25-year life on a low-cost built shed that's ambient and so on and so forth. When you start putting freezer centres together and that sort of kit, we're still using 1960s freezer centres, 1970 freezer centres, so you can't easily move those. So that's the sort of time horizon you're talking about. And I think this is the point really that I've got to take away from Christian, is that what we're talking about is a blip on the horizon compared to the whole programme. So yeah, we've, as you say, by 2040, Christian, we'll have 30% of travel by bike of some description, probably electric bike, actually, just thinking about that. And we'll have different sorts of roadways to accommodate that sort of thing. But the other thing that we have is consolidation of delivery and consolidation of collection and various other things. But we've had a big change in the last 18 months of a massive change over to the freight being delivered to your doorstep, as opposed to you collecting it from effectively a form of a distribution centre. So a retail store is a small distribution centre when you think about it. So what you've done now is you've changed, we've all changed our behaviour such that now the retail store has been taken out of the loop. So previously you might have had an 18-ton rigid going from a distribution centre to a retail store. Somebody else jumps in their car, bus, bike, whatever it might be, and goes to that mini retail store called a shop and collects it. So you've actually knocked out you've halved the number of times a piece of freight's handled, which knocks out a lot of labour as well, of course, don't forget. So there's a lot less people employed in the sector, and a much smaller part of your industrial asset in the city, i.e. shops, that's no longer being used. So that's, but actually, is it more efficient for a small van to go and deliver 150 deliveries a day, or 150 people going to deliver and pick up from a retail store? I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to work that one out. So it's right you asked the question, and I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but we've got a process now whereby, I mean, if you take from someone like, I mean, well, without going into details, it's a lot more efficient doing the second than the first, isn't it? If you've got a van making 150 deliveries a day rather than 150 people making 150 deliveries a day, that can't be a good thing.
Okay, it's interesting because again, that whole bit around, big events like this sometimes do spark that innovation and that different way of looking at things. And I'm curious, and I'm sure we'll see some of this roll out even more as things develop. Megan, I just want to come back to you and a sort of general question, really. And I'll be interested in the people that are on the call tonight about how deep their knowledge was of what's happening. And we've had conversations, haven't we, on various calls around that sort of, we need to get this out to as many people as
the
possible.
Awareness raising, yeah.
Yeah, rather than sort of, people suddenly get caught out by it. What more can be done just to make more people aware of this? Because, like I said, the impact, if you've just got a private vehicle, it probably won't impact you or whatever. You'll see the signs going up for this, that and the other, and it probably won't touch you. But I do think there's an important message behind this, that there is that improvement in air quality coming through this and the knock-on effects about that. What more needs to be done just to raise awareness?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in terms of what we're doing in Greater Manchester, we're using all the channels that we've got. We're trying to build our networks to make sure that, people do subscribe so we can let them know the latest iteration, because I think we're conscious of the fact that not everybody's on social media. We're obviously working very closely with the Greater Manchester authorities, who've also got channels and networks too. We are using DVLA data because we think that that's the best source of actually putting something physical on somebody's doormat. But I think when you look at the fact that there are clean air zones coming in or are in across the country, then there probably does need to be more of a national campaign around this, so people understand what they are and what they are trying to achieve in terms of improving air quality for the, to deal with the health impacts of having poor levels of nitrogen dioxide and obviously other air pollutants as well.
Yeah, interesting stuff. And again, from a chamber perspective, we're working closely with TFGM to get that message out to as many people as possible. Certainly where I live in Standish, we've had a sudden explosion of the signs and things going up, and it's amazing when you look at some of the Facebook groups, people's interpretation of what it is. It's Andy Burnham's congestion charge is the most frequent thing, which I do refrain from trying to get involved too much and saying no, it's not, because I just don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole. But it is interesting. People are noticing the signs, and I think that's something that's just making people aware. We've just got a couple of minutes left before we close at 6:15, and like I said, last chance for any questions from guests on the call. Christian, just want to come back to you, and again put your sort of economist's head on here. I guess this is probably such a broad question, you may not be able to answer it, but we are at a particularly difficult time with what Mark's outlined, and again, certainly we've done a bit of work, and I know the call to government was like, is there any way we can just delay this even another 12 months or whatever it is? I guess it's really, there's no good time for this to happen. But bearing in mind where we are with all the costs and things like this, is there a danger that we could actually be inadvertently making the local economy worse by doing this now? Or, is there a benefit to just delaying it 12 months?
It's a very big question and very complex. I think generally the way we tend to look at these sorts of things, so you've got build-up, so you've got long-term effects, essentially. Air quality doesn't just... If you clean the air quality tomorrow, that doesn't help people who've already been breathing that air quality a long time. So essentially, we bake in costs for the long term, which will be felt in productivity, in spend on health recovery of people affected, and all that kind of thing. So generally, if you run the numbers, they tend to work on the principle of act sooner. That essentially, if you delay a year, all you do is bake in another year of. So if we think the CBI estimate's right, I've not looked at the detail of the model. They say 26 million a year net benefit. Then you're 26 million down in 1 year, but you're also that capitalization, the value, you get yourself 26 million higher up in one go, and then that goes on year after year after year after year. And so why wouldn't you start reaping those benefits more quickly? And I kind of come back to my point earlier, which is about set this in context with the other things. So there's nitrogen oxide to remove, essentially because government's being sued and we're being told it has to fix it. So that's part of that. That doesn't actually do very much for carbon reduction. Obviously, getting to cleaner engines will help, but that's only making a small dent in that. There's the wider decarbonisation agenda. And if you get everyone onto electric cars, then great, you solve your NO2 problem and you solve your carbon agenda, but you still have congestion and you still have brake dust problems and you still have all the rest of it. So it's like each of these still needs dealing with. And I think the risk, one of the things we've probably all have found frustrating with the government over sort of policy decision stuff is this stuff doesn't go away if you boot it another 12 months. You still have to deal with it. You'll have to deal with it faster if you're having to meet external targets. So, the big problem with the net zero stuff, it's like, another couple of years drifts by before government implements the next thing. That means you just have to bring it all down faster. So you're going to have to spend more money over a shorter period to try and solve the problem. So start now, the old thing about move quick, start small, move fast, to actually start making some of these things. And government can take a multi-economic cycle view over this stuff. At the end of the day, whether this is introduced this year or next year, I understand entirely from the micro perspective. So for each individual business, whether you spend, I don't know, 25 grand getting a newer second-hand truck today, or you can wait a year and that 25 grand will only be 15 grand, that's a massive difference at an individual company level. The point is across all of this policy area, from even a GM, but certainly from a national government level, whether you go this year or next year is a rounding error in terms of spend. And the policy needs doing anyway. I think the one thing that, even Mark, I'm sure, most of the freight associations agree with. We agree with the objective. There's no doubt the objective has to happen. It's how you do it and how you smooth the path. But ultimately, that's what governments are for, is to help this kind of thing along.
Interesting answer to that question there, because again, one of the things we hear a lot of is delay, but you might actually be making the problems and the impact worse by doing that. I'm interested to hear your views on that. So just about reached the hour mark, and that's been a really interesting discussion. That and like I said, there's such a wide range of issues coming together under this. The cleaner zone. Megan will probably disagree with what I'm going to say. Sounds a very simple thing, but when you get into it, you realise the complexity, the need for it, and one thing or another is completely different. So again, it is important we do get that message out to people, and it will be interesting to see what actually happens. A lot of things we're talking about here is theory. We know it's going to start at the end of May next year, not this year, next year, with HGV. So we'll begin to see at some early stage what that starts to look like. The funding is open now for HGVs as well. We're beginning to see applications coming through for that. So we've got some real life experience there of what is going to be coming further on down the road. No pun intended. I'd just like to thank our speakers, Megan, Mark, and of course Christian, for giving us their views. Thank you so much for giving up your time, and thanks also for people joining us tonight on this event. Our next event in this series is taking place on the 19th of January. So I'd just like to take this opportunity, I've done this a few times today, just to wish everyone all the best for Christmas. Have a happy new year, and obviously at the present moment in time, please stay safe as best you possibly can. Thanks very much for joining us, and hope to see you all very, very soon. Thank you.